President Trump under fire for failing to condemn in any way white supremacists, KKK, neo-Nazis by name, or distancing himself from these extreme groups. Let's bring back in our panel John Avlon, Ron Brownstein, Abby Phillip. And John, to you, it also goes to the question of who's around the president in the West Wing, right? The New York Times editorial board this morning notes that he consulted the president, a lot of people, before giving the remarks that he gave on Saturday, where he didn't blame these groups. He just said many sides, many sides. He also has Steve Bannon around him, you know, who called Breitbart, which he founded, the platform for the alt-right.
A site that was oddly quiet in coverage.
Very. Yeah. And Sebastian Gorka, who said this just earlier this month.
It's this constant, oh, it's the white man, it's the white supremacist, that's the problem. No, it isn't, Maggie Haberman. Go to Sinjar. Go to the Middle East and tell me what the real problem is today. Go to Manchester.
So?
Yeah. So what you got here, I think, is a question of who was in the room when Donald Trump's remarks were being made? Who encouraged him not to call out these groups by name?
They say he spoke with a number of advisors.
Right, no, exactly.
So this wasn't out of haste.
Right, exactly. And that's what's troubling, right? And when you have a nationalist wing, an ethno-nationalist wing of political advisors driving a president's agenda, this is the kind of thing you get. You know, Breitbart has a complicated relationship, I don't know why I'm putting it politely, with issues of difference, particularly with the African-American community, with the Muslim community. Sebastian Gorka on Inauguration Day wore a medal from a Hungarian resistance group that gave an award to his father, which has been associated with Nazis in the past. This is not the kind of crew you typically see advising an American president. And you got to believe that these deliberate omissions by the president are driven, at least in part, by advisors who seem to have a vested interest in stoking these flames on the part of a portion of their base. Again, it's the ethno-nationalist. Let's not be too polite about it. That's another name for white nationalists.
Right. Well, look, you got the moral component, which, again, Abby, you know, you laid out the right way. We're not used to hearing any contextual discussion of many sides when you're dealing with people that hate African Americans, Jews, Italians, Catholics. I mean, there are a lot of people that they put on their hateful little lists. You don't usually see any type of equivalency drawn on that or any type of limitation on condemnation of them. You also have a factual problem here. We talked about the logical one. Why are you so intent on calling out Muslims, but you won't dignify calling out Nazis? Doesn't make any sense logically. But the fact problem, why did David Duke say this? Listen to this.
We are determined to take our country back. We're going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump. That's what we believed in. That's why we voted for Donald Trump, because he said he's going to take our country back, and that's what we got to do.
Now, let's give the best defense in this situation, which is, hey, they are latching on to Trump wrongfully. He didn't want them. But you would think, if that's the case, you would deny them most of all if you were Trump or anyone around him, because that's the last thing you'd want. And then we get the kind of language that we had here, which is not doing that, to say the least, Abby.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be a pretty easy decision. David Duke says that you support that he supports Donald Trump. Trump supports him. It should be easy to say that's not true. I reject his support. I disavow him. I think, Chris, we should also really point out here that a White House aide, Sebastian Gorka, essentially glossing over white supremacy as a problem is a huge movement away from the norm. I think we cannot lose sight of that.
Right. And it's factually incorrect.
And it's factually
incorrect.
Go
to Sinjar. But we're not in Sinjar. We're in America.
Exactly.
And white supremacy is the #1 terror threat that they deal with in our government in this country.
Yeah, we have to. We cannot let that slide, because that's the reality. Is that's not something that would be acceptable in any other administration. I mean, but also, I think this White House is dealing with, yes, the president was advised by a lot of people. He heard a lot of input. There were a lot of people in the White House advising him to give a more fulsome response, as you can see based on the fact that Vice President Mike Pence did give a more fulsome response. But the president himself heard about what happened in Charlottesville, and he heard about the various groups descending on the city, and he was the one who decided, we have to condemn all sides of this. There are a lot of folks within this White House, Trump aides, who believe that there is not enough condemnation of the quote unquote violent left as there is of the violent right. That is the wrong frame for this. I think that what you're hearing from Republicans outside of the White House, folks like Cory Gardner, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, is that there is no equivalency here. Wrong is wrong, right is right, and the White House needs to point that out. The president is the one making a decision not to do that.
Hey guys, just to note, after the horrific Paris terror attack on the Bataclan, etc., it was then civilian Donald Trump who tweeted, "When will President Obama issue the words radical Islamic terrorism? He can't say it, and unless he will, the problem will not be solved." Okay. Directly tying the language to the problem. Right. Hold on, you guys, really quickly. I do want to get to this. Think what you will about Anthony Scaramucci, the former White House communications director, and his short tenure in the White House. However, in his first interview yesterday, he called out Bannon, and he said he, being the president, has to move away from this sort of Bannon-Bart. Now, big picture here, CNN has reporting from multiple reporters of ours that Bannon is on the outs with the president. Could this hurt him more, Ron?
Sure. I mean, I think look, as I said before, I don't think there's anything surprising about this reaction from the president. It is exactly the pattern, the template that he has used before. I think what's different is if this would have happened in February, you would not have seen nearly as much reaction from Republicans as well as Democrats. There's a cumulative weight of things he has said and done that are outside the boundaries, outside the norms of what you would expect from a U.S. president that I think has kind of created a greater willingness to kind of criticize from the beginning. And, so we'll see. I mean, I think that, for Bannon, he has been, we talked about before, that being a continuum, not being a bright line separating these kinds of groups from others who are uneasy about demographic change. That has been part of the mission of Breitbart, I think, to break down those boundaries as a kind of a media institution. And to the extent that he continues to do that in the White House, I think he is more vulnerable now simply because there is this greater willingness to call out some of the things that the president said and done. Earlier, I think you would have heard Paul Ryan say something like, well, I can't comment on everything the president says. We need to get back to our agenda. Now you are seeing more Republicans saying this is unacceptable. This is outside the boundaries of what we would accept from a U.S. president.
And the president, who was not shy on Twitter, not shy about watching the show and commenting about what happens in real time, just tweeted, heading to Washington this morning. Much work to do. Focus on trade and military. Hashtag MAGA, Make America Great Again. Still no word from the president about what he knows he's being asked to clarify this morning. Appreciate it, panel. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you in a little bit. Now, tomorrow on New Day, we're going to have former White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci. What does he believe led to his dismissal? What does he believe led to this weird situation that we're dealing with right now with what the president didn't say? Who would tell the president not to mention these kinds of groups, to go easy on them?
Also, a deadly terrorist attack in West Africa. Gunmen opened fire at a restaurant that is frequented there by foreigners. The late-breaking details are next.
We're following breaking news. At least 18 people are dead after a terror attack in the West African nation of Burkina Faso. Authorities in the capital say a group of gunmen opened fire at a restaurant that's popular with foreign visitors. State media reported security forces did kill 2 of the terrorists. There was no immediate claim of responsibility.
The U.S. military is investigating a combat incident in northern Iraq that killed 2 U.S. service members and injured 5 others. The Pentagon says it was not due to enemy contact. So what happened? They're investigating. The names of the casualties have not been released yet.
The New York Times is reporting that special counsel Bob Mueller is going to reach out to the White House to set up interviews with current and former administration officials, including former Chief of Staff Reince Priebus. Why? Well, Mueller is reportedly asking for details about specific meetings as part of the Russia investigation.
America's top general in Seoul, South Korea, trying to defuse tension with North Korea. Does diplomacy?
Breaking news, America's top general in South Korea pushing for diplomacy, but also saying military options remain on the table in the escalating tensions with North Korea. CNN's Paula Hancock is live in Seoul, South Korea, and has breaking details. What do we know?
Well, Chris, we're hearing from General Dunford just recently about a meeting he had here with the South Korean President Moon Jae-in. He said that the military priority at this point is to try and support peaceful North Korean resolution. He says that nobody is looking for a war, but it's important for the military to have a viable military option if the other options don't work. He also referred to an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal from two top US officials who basically said that it was more important to look now at the diplomatic, the economic issues, and the military option is there as well. This has been said once again by General Dunford. Also, we're hearing more about these US-South Korean military drills, which will be starting on August 21st here in South Korea. North Korea, through its state-run media today, saying that there is a danger that could lead to war, saying that if there is a second Korean war, it will be a nuclear war. North Korea is also always infuriated by these military drills by the US and South Korea, but General Dunford said they will go ahead.
I would tell you that today, when you look at the rhetoric coming out of North Korea, the exercises are more important than ever. And as General Brooks talked about, there's a direct linkage between these exercises and our ability to effectively respond.
So what we're hearing really from a number of US diplomats today is that it's almost a pullback from that rhetoric we heard from US President Donald Trump last week, saying that diplomacy is the most important. Poppy, back to you.
Paula Hancock's in Seoul. Thank you very much. Joining us now, CNN military and diplomatic analyst, Rear Admiral John Kirby, and Gordon Chang, Daily Beast columnist and author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. Gentlemen, nice to have you both. You know, the message, Admiral, from the administration, from so many sides over the weekend and this morning, as we just heard from General Dunford, is diplomacy above all. I mean, you had Dunford coming out of that meeting today and saying the priority of the U.S. military is to support a peaceful resolution to the North Korean crisis. Is this the administration, those around the president, trying to tamp down his own rhetoric from last week?
I actually think that, yeah, Poppy, a lot of what we've seen since the fire and fury comment of Tuesday of last week has been senior cabinet officials and administration officials trying to put context around that, walk back a little bit from the tension, and absolutely push the diplomacy forward. And you saw that with Mattis last week. You're certainly seeing it with General Dunford today in South Korea. And, you know, frankly, that's the appropriate approach here. I think there's still room for diplomacy and economic pressure to work. And so I think they're approaching this the right way. But to me, it's a little like they're acting as sandpaper, trying to take off some of the rough edges from President Trump.
So, Gordon Chang, you disagree. I mean, you read the op-ed this morning in Wall Street Journal by Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis, and they say it's time to replace this failed strategy of strategic patience with strategic accountability. They went on to say the U.S. is willing to negotiate with Pyongyang, and they talk about pressuring China to the ultimate extent. You say not going to work. Why?
Well, you know, they talk about strategic accountability in this op-ed, and then they don't discuss China's money laundering for the North Koreans, its supply of equipment and probably technology for the ballistic missile program, the supply of fissile material for North Korea's nuclear weapons program, and continual sanctions busting. And I think what they're going to read this in Beijing is saying, oh, this is more of the same. You know, we've seen this in previous administrations. What they need to see in Beijing in order to move in a better direction is the United States taking a new attitude. Yes, it's sort of diplomacy, and I agree with Admiral Kirby, but it's coercive diplomacy. It's got to say to the Chinese, we can impose costs on you.
They've sanctioned a big Chinese bank. They could slap a lot tougher sanctions on bigger Chinese banks and really cut a lot of their ability off, and they haven't done that yet. Admiral, to you, you had former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper under President Obama, who, by the way, also served under President Bush. He served under Republicans and Democrats. Here's what he said over the weekend.
I'd love a denuclearized North Korea, but as I learned when I went there and had some pretty intense dialogue with them, that is a non-starter with them. That is their ticket to survival, and I don't see any way they're going to give it up. So I think our thought process here ought to be on accepting it and trying to cap it or control it. But I think a denuclearized North Korea, I'd love to see it, but I don't think that's in the cards.
I mean, he says accept a nuclearized North Korea. McMaster has very clearly said that's intolerable. So where does that leave this administration?
It puts them in a very tough spot. I mean, look, they have been the North has been racing towards these programs and capabilities now for a long time, and arguably, whether we want to admit it or not, or accept it or not officially, they have a nuclear capability. So we have to deal with that reality. How you do that diplomatically, I think, is for people smarter than me to figure out. Although I associate myself with Director Clapper's comments, I think we do need to look at this pragmatically and move forward from there. I also agree with Gordon about pressure on China. He's right. China has been enabling this growth of the capability, and China has not implemented sanctions fully the way they're supposed to. They do have more influence than any other nation in the world on Pyongyang, although even they, I think, are finding that there's some limits to that. But I think he's right. They do need to continue to push more pressure on China and Beijing to do more to help solve this problem.
There was a phone call between President Trump and the governor of Guam over the weekend, and it was recorded and posted online, and part of it was striking. Listen to this.
Hey, I have to tell you, you've become extremely famous. All over the world, they're talking about Guam, and they're talking about you, and I think you're going to get tourism. I can say this, your tourism, you're going to go up in like 10-fold with the expenditure of no money, so I congratulate you. Now, it looks beautiful. You know, I'm watching, we're showing so much, it's such a big story in the news, and it just looks like a beautiful place.
Guam is beautiful. I don't think tourism levels in Guam are the key concern right now, Gordon Chang. You hung your head while you were watching that. Explain.
I mean, that's pure Trump. I mean, one can sort of explain that. He's trying to give confidence to the Guamanians, you know, try to say, oh, this is no big deal. And in a certain extent, that's what presidents do at times of crisis. But that's completely the wrong tone right now, and especially to make it about himself, about how he's famous.
I mean, it's this week that Kim Jong-un is supposed to potentially approve that plan that the North Koreans said they have to fire 4 missiles right off the coast of Guam.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the reason why, you know, Trump needs to have a much different tone, not only when it comes to Guam, but also all the other players. And the really problem here is the United States has not been able to marshal its elements of power to do what's necessary. There's been very little message discipline, all the rest of it. And you see the problem in that call with the governor of Guam. It's just symptomatic of a failure right now of the U.S. to have a much more disciplined approach.
Gordon Chang, Admiral Kirby, gentlemen, thank you both. Chris?
All right, so the president is awake and tweeting, but he is not tweeting about the deadly violence at the hands of white supremacists. Remember, when it's about calling out radical Islamic terror, he can't talk specifically enough. He says it's fundamental to dealing with the problem. What about this problem? Next. The president is up and tweeting this morning. He's talking about how to make America great again. He's talking about politics in Alabama, but he is not talking about white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and the KKK. Why won't he mention these specific hate groups in relation to what happened in Virginia, or just in relation to the terror climate in America? These are the groups responsible for the most investigations into terror in this country. Joining us now to discuss our former Vice Chair of Diversity Outreach for the National Diversity Coalition for Trump, Brunel Donald Che, and Michael Eric Dyson, Professor of Sociology at Georgetown and author of the book, Tears We Cannot Stop, a Sermon to White America. Professor, we start with you. What is your analysis of what the president did and did not say?
Well, Chris, thanks for having me this morning. It's an unfortunate opportunity that the president missed. It's a tragic reflection of the fact that he has aided and abetted, whether consciously or not, the forces of white supremacy in this country. And be clear, we're not simply talking about the external violence and the terror that are manifest. White supremacy is the conscious or unconscious belief in the inherent inferiority of some and the inherent superiority of others. So white supremacy as a thought metastasizes across the body politic. The president had the opportunity to say clearly and directly, I am not part of this. I do not have truck with this. When David Duke, a white nationalist and separatist, reaches out to try to support me, I repudiate repudiate his support. And I suggest that in America, we are not towing the line of white supremacy, but we're opposed to it. He had the opportunity to use the bully pulpit of this country to say there is a violent history of terror exercised against many others, including especially African American people. The resurgence of neo-Nazism under his own administration suggests that they find comfort and succor in a president who refuses to be explicit. That was a missed opportunity because it's an expression of a deeply entrenched ideology of hate and animus toward African American and others that needs to be explicitly repudiated.
Brunel, you spent a lot of your time fighting injustice. The idea that this is a problem on many sides, said the president, suggesting that those who are fighting against hateful people like the KKK are part of the problem. What's your take?
Good morning. God bless you and God bless America, Counselor. Thanks for having us here. What I'll say to you is this. I'll go with an example. You know, you come into your home as a father and you see 3 kids fighting. The first thing you're going to do is stop the fighting. The second thing you're going to do is condemn the fighting. And then the third thing you're going to do is find out, get to the bottom of what happened. That's the same thing here that the president did. He disavowed any bigotry, hate of all kinds, any kind of extremism, after the police, of course, broke all this up. And then the third thing he did was say, look, I'm going to send Jeff Sessions down here to investigate. He's done what a leader is supposed to do. We know that many of these extremists, whether on the left or whether they're on the right, they are media monsters. And what do you do to a monster? You starve it. You don't feed it. And so I think that the president has shown great leadership in showing that he's not going to let anybody on the left who's a radical extremist tell him what to do, nor is he going to let anybody on the right who's extremist determine how he's going to lead. Our president he basically got a situation where there's been so much division in the nation, and him blanketly disavowing all bigotry and hatred, I believe, is the best thing that he could have done for this nation.
Professor?
Well, let me say this. First of all, let's shift the analogy because your metaphor is insufficient. Let's talk about a burning house. You come to the house. One person is an arson trying to start the fire. Another is a fireman trying to put it out. What Trump did was essentially reinforce the status quo where the arson is really firebombing the house and another group of people are trying to put that fire out. Number 2, Martin Luther King Jr. was called an extremist by a group of Alabama clergymen that led him to write his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. He said, at first I was disturbed to be categorized as an extremist. He said, it doesn't matter if you're characterized as an extremist, it's what you're an extremist for. He said, Abraham Lincoln was an extremist for justice. He said, Martin Luther was the same. John Bunyan in his jail was the same. Amos was an extremist for justice. So if you're an extremist for justice, that's fine. If you're an extremist against justice, if you're a white supremacist, there is no such thing as a false equivalency between Black Lives Matter, which grew out of the movement to repudiate the acceptance of the fact that Black lives did not matter and that Black kids were being killed and people were being killed in the street, versus white supremacists whose idea is to subvert and undermine the very patriotism that this country supposedly rests on. So this notion that the president has to come and then adjudicate between competing claims, Black Lives Matter on the one hand, and on the other hand, white supremacists, is nonsense. The reality is either you are a part and parcel of an American society that reinforces the value of justice and democracy, or you're not. White supremacists are in league with those who would undermine the capacity of this country to fully grasp hold of that. So this false equivalency is part of the problem, and Donald Trump, unless he comes out to explicitly articulate his resistance, is reinforcing the value of white supremacy in our own time.
Brunel.
If I may respond, I'll tell you this. I know one group followed the law and got a permit to go down there and to protest. And that is the white nationalist group. You don't have to love or like anything they espouse. No, I don't. I'm sure you don't. But the thing about it is they did follow our law and got a permit. It was Antifa and these other extremist groups that came in protesting that did not have a permit. And another thing that was an issue here, there was not sufficient police presence there. You've got white nationalists there. You've got Antifa and other extremist groups. There should have have been a proper police presence there. I live in Chicago. People protest all the time. Our mayor makes sure that there are police officers and different people there to protect. So this is the issue. White supremacists, black nationalists, everybody has a right to peacefully protest. And when you go and you follow the law and you get your permit, you should be under proper protection and you should be able to exercise that free speech. These people, they went there to go and protest the fact that Robert Lee's statue was being taken down. They had a right to be there.
Right. Well,
yes.
it
was peaceful until Antifa arrived.
All right. Well, a couple of point clarifications. One.
So those are the facts.
Well, let me add to them. One is going there for the statue being brought down is one reason they were there, but clearly the agenda was far more than just that. And secondly, local police there found it to be an unlawful assembly. They may have filed a permit, but once the police were able to assess the facts on the ground of why they were really there and what they wanted to achieve, it was found to break the law there locally for what is allowed as lawful assembly, and that's why they wanted them to disperse. So those are facts as well in terms of who was there to do the right thing versus the wrong thing. Professor, the point about proper policing, that's a legitimate issue. We're going to take it up with the mayor from Charlottesville, but that's not really the context of this discussion. Brunel, what doesn't make sense here is the Nazis, the KKK, the white supremacists, they are about hate. That's what they're about. Why assume that there is some type of equality between them and people who are fighting against them in this country? Everybody in this conversation right now is targeted by these groups.
But people have the right to freedom of speech. They have the right to the freedom. Excuse me, sir.
One at a time. One at a time. One at a time. Brunel, quick response from you, and then final word to the professor.
You spoke last, Brunel.
All right, but hold on a second. Final quick word from Brunel, and then the professor. Brunel, go ahead.
Yes, I was taught to respect my elders, sir. What I will say is that they have the right to the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly. Again, you don't have to like what somebody's espousing in order for their rights to be protected. We know that human liberties begin to fail when freedom of speech and freedom of assembly is taken away.
Fine.
And so I'm not here. I don't want anything to do with any white nationalists, for God's sakes. But what I'm telling you is, as a lawyer, we know in court all the time, you may end up representing someone you may not agree with, but that doesn't mean they don't have the right to assemble.
No, that's true. But nobody's arguing.
That's all I'm
nobody's
saying.
arguing what their right is. Just because they have a right doesn't make it right. And this is about moral leadership from the president. But Professor, final word to you.
Right. Yeah. This false equivalency that's been introduced this morning is part and parcel of the problem. Our other guests' viewpoint reinforces the status quo, which reinforces white supremacy. And your point is that, look, there is no false equivalency between those who are opposed to hate and those who will foment it. Those who are articulated conception of American democracy that is full and vibrant versus those who are narrow and pinched in their conception of what it is. That's why even a black person can reinforce white supremacist ideology while people who are white can undermine it. And what we have to understand, it's not about white versus black. It's about right versus wrong. And white supremacist ideology undercuts the value of American democracy for all of us. And unless the president stands up to suggest that this notion that Black Lives Matter on the one hand and white supremacist groups on the other are equal is part and parcel of what we have to fight in this country. And until he says that, we will continue to have this problem in America of domestic terrorism.
All right. An ugly situation, to be sure.
On both sides is wrong.
Extremism,
it doesn't matter to
Martin Luther King Jr. said extremists for good, extremists for evil. Extremists for good, extremists for evil.
Brunel,
not
Professor,
evil on either side.
This is an ugly situation. It demands conversation, and I am happy that we were able to have some of it here this morning. Thank you to you both. All right? There is a lot of
New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
All right, welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is New Day. It's Monday, August 14th, 6 o'clock here in New York. Allison is off. Poppy Harlow joining me. Thank you for doing so. Be together all week. Here's our starting line. Democrats and Republicans united in blasting the president's response to the violence sparked by white supremacists in Virginia. The president did condemn violence but said on many sides, twice, he said something that shocks the conscience of members of both political parties and people across this country. The Vice President, Mike Pence, defending the president, blasting the media for scrutinizing his deafening silence. But then the Vice President did exactly what the president did not do. He condemned white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and the KKK by name.
And naming them is critical. Meantime, the suspected attacker will be arraigned in just a few hours. He's accused of driving his car straight into that crowd, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer for standing up to hate and voicing that. A high school teacher says the suspect was a Nazi sympathizer who long idolized Adolf Hitler. All of this as America's top general is in South Korea pushing for a diplomatic solution. Yet he says military options are indeed prepared in case sanctions on North Korea fail to defuse the nuclear threat. We have this all covered for you on a busy Monday morning. Let's begin with CNN's Jeff Zeleny. He is live in Bridgewater, New Jersey, where the president is on this working vacation. Still, retweets from the president this morning of other things, political things, but silence on this.
Good morning, Poppy. It is a vague silence. We have heard President Trump, of course, he's known for being outspoken and blunt when he wants to be. But Sunday, yesterday, marked only the 4th day of his presidency where he was completely silent on social media. Now, all of this is coming as he's facing renewed criticism over failing to call out those white supremacists from the deadly violence in Charlottesville.
We have no tolerance for hate and violence from white supremacists, neo-Nazis, or the KKK.
Vice President Mike Pence doing publicly what President Trump did not over the weekend, directly condemning white supremacists by name after the deadly violence in Charlottesville.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
The vice president coming to the president's defense in the face of growing backlash over Mr. Trump's response.
President Trump clearly and unambiguously condemned the bigotry, violence, and hatred which took place. I take issue with the fact that many in the national media spend more time criticizing the president's words than they did criticizing those who perpetrated the violence to begin with.
The White House releasing a statement from an unnamed spokesperson Sunday, 36 hours after the protest began, insisting President Trump's comments decrying bigotry includes white supremacists, KKK, neo-Nazi, and all extremist groups. Top aides to the president also pushing back on the Sunday shows.
The president's been very clear. We cannot tolerate this kind of bigotry, this kind of hatred.
The president not only condemned the violence and stood up at a time and a moment when calm was necessary, and didn't dignify the names of these groups and people, but rather addressed the fundamental issue.
President Trump ignored multiple questions from reporters after his statement on Saturday.
Mr. President, do you want the support of these white nationalist groups who say they support you, Mr. President?
Mr. President,
have you denounced them strongly enough?
A par-planted group of people, would you call that terrorism, sir?
We just aren't seeing leadership from the White House.
The president's refusal to denounce the groups by name drawing fierce backlash from his own party.
And I would urge the president to dissuade them of the fact that he's sympathetic to their cause, because their cause is hate. It is un-American. They are domestic terrorists, and we need more from our president.
Call this white supremacism, this white nationalism evil, and let the country hear it, let the world hear it. It's something that needs to come from the Oval Office, and this White House needs to do it today.
Now, the president is interrupting his working vacation here in New Jersey to fly back to Washington later this morning to sign an unrelated piece of legislation on China trade policy. But, Poppy, still so many questions here about the president's comments on this. White House aides tell me this morning they believe he will take questions on
Bannon a little later and hope the president does take those important questions today in that press conference he promised that he would have. The man accused of driving a car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer, injuring 19 others. He'll be arraigned in just hours. A former teacher of the attacker claims that he proudly proclaimed himself a Nazi sympathizer. Let's go to Kaylee Hartung. She is live in Charlottesville. What else are we learning ahead of this arraignment?
Well, Poppy, James Alex Fields Jr. will be arraigned at 10 a.m. this morning. He's currently being held in the Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail, and he will remain there and appear in the courtroom today via a video teleconference. He'll be facing one charge of second-degree murder. Among others, the DOJ and the FBI also conducting a civil rights investigation into the assault. Now, investigators will be looking into this man's past to help determine his motive, and we're learning more about the 20-year-old man from Ohio. While his mother said just moments after learning of the charges against her son that she'd never really discussed his political beliefs with him, one of his high school teachers is providing some insight.
He had some very radical views on race. He was very infatuated with the Nazis, with Adolf Hitler. He also had a huge military history, especially with like German military history in World War II. But he was pretty infatuated with that stuff.
The U.S. Army confirms to our Pentagon reporter Barbara Starr that Fields reported for basic training in August of 2015. He didn't meet the basic training standards and he left the service in December of that same year. We're also learning more about the victim, 32-year-old Heather Heyer from the Charlottesville area. There was a vigil scheduled last night in her honor, but because of perceived threats, the organizers canceled the event. Mourners continue to lay flowers at the crash site as a makeshift memorial has been set up there. Now, Heyer's mother says that she had always been someone wanting to help others.
It was important to her to speak up for people that she felt were not being heard, to speak up when injustices were happening. And she saw in the lives of many of her African American friends particularly, and her gay friends, that equal rights were not being given.
Heyer was a paralegal for a Charlottesville law firm. Now, the law enforcement community also mourning the loss of two of their own as a helicopter crashed as it was surveying the violence in the area. Pilot Lieutenant H.J. Cullen and Trooper Pilot Burke Bates lost their lives. Now, Governor Terry McAuliffe knew both of these men personally. As he said, these heroes were a part of our family and we are simply heartbroken. The president also offered his condolences on Twitter. On this Monday morning, the barricades that we saw in this park throughout the weekend, the center of the controversy here in Emancipation Park, where Confederate General Robert E. Lee's statue stands. Well, those barricades are gone, the streets are open, but Poppy, there is a lot of healing left to do in Charlottesville.
All right, Kaylee, thank you very much. Let's bring in our political panel. CNN senior political analyst Ron Brownstein and CNN political analysts John Avlon and Abby Phillip. John Avlon, we want to keep mentioning Heather Heyer. We want to keep mentioning the troopers because hate took lives down there in Virginia, and we want to remember the people that were resistant to that hatred. That's important. Equally important is the message from our leadership. And Mike Pence, the vice president, can say whatever he wants. The president created a WTF moment with what he did and did not say about this event. Him repeating on many sides, didn't just not make sense contextually, but is completely baffling given the circumstances. How do you explain it?
I don't think you can explain it, which is why the White House has been scrambling, trying to play offense, but not really addressing the president's problem, which is doubling down on that on many sides comment on the day this was all going down. Look, this isn't really subtle here, folks. This isn't a high bar for presidential leadership, condemning neo-Nazis and white supremacists. And even on the Friday night in the square, there are young men giving Nazi salutes in front of a statue of Robert E. Lee. If that's not, that's not a misunderstanding, that's nothing you should consider any part of your base. That's something that needs to be clearly condemned. And if it can't be clearly condemned, then people got to look really hard in the mirror. And that's not to say the president is a part of these groups, but if he is in any way encouraging or empowering these groups, as online comments subsequent to the statement said from neo-Nazi websites, basically saying he called the other side haters, this is a victory for us. That's a problem. If it can't be seen, it needs to be confronted. We need to have this conversation as a country now.
If you stand by silently, then what? This country has learned that lesson too many times. Ron Brownstein, something from John Meacham that stood out to me on Twitter last night and got a lot of people talking. History will judge the president's wordplay over resurgent white nationalism harshly and Later, white nationalism, the KKK. Does it matter if the president doesn't say it out loud?
Sure, and I think he's already sent the message that he means to send. I actually don't think this is a WTF moment or hard to explain. It's hard to justify. It's not hard to explain. It's exactly to the T what he did with David Duke on the Sunday before the key southern states voted in the Republican primary last year, where he sent his clear signal by what he did not say initially, by not condemning him. And then only when elite opinion and kind of broad opinion across both parties condemned him did he come out with the denunciation, which I am sure is coming eventually here too after this signal has been said.
Let's play it. This is what he said to Jake back when he was being asked about this during the campaign with David Duke. All right. Well, we will have it in a little bit.
And just to finish the point, which is there is a relatively small, there's a minuscule percentage of Americans who completely sympathize with KKK or Nazi ideology and imagery, but there are a much broader universe of Americans who are uneasy about demographic, racial, and cultural change. And from the beginning, President Trump has signaled his sympathy to those voters in a variety of ways, from the ways he described Mexicans in the first, his first press conference, and saying that Judge Curiel could not, judge fairly in a case because of his heritage, to what he said about David Duke. And he has.
Well, here it is, Ron. Let's listen to this so people have some context. Here's the sound.
Absolutely.
I didn't even know he endorsed me. David Duke endorsed me? Okay. All right. I disavow. Okay?
Will you unequivocally condemn David Duke and say that you don't want his vote or that of other white supremacists in this election?
Well, just so you understand, I don't know anything about David Duke, okay? I don't know anything about what you're even talking about with white supremacy or white supremacists.
Now, just for timing context, one, we screwed up and we flipped those two bites. The disavowal came after it. And also, it just wasn't that it was about what he was saying. He had complete evidence of who David Duke was. And he had also denied him earlier. He once was going to run for president with part of this party called the Reform Party, and Duke was connected to it. And he said at that time, I don't want anything to do with this guy. I don't want to be connected to him. So now it changed.
Just to finish the point, Chris, it was the Sunday before the largest number of southern states voted in the Republican primary. So, I mean, that was very calculated. And then eventually, he kind of provides the denunciation that the bipartisan critics demand, but after he has sent his signal. And again, he has done very well from the beginning with the elements of American society that are most uneasy about racial changes. This big debate was his vote driven by economic anxiety or cultural and demographic anxiety. In fact, the two are braided together. And many of the same voters are most uneasy, feel the most eclipsed by what's happening in the economy and what's happening demographically. And the president has been unwilling to kind of draw a clear, bright line isolating these groups, not, I think, because so many Americans are sympathetic to them, but because it's part of a continuum of views that he has played on and has spoken to, I think, as clearly as he possibly could.
Abby, New York Times editorial board this morning writes, Mr. Trump is alone in modern presidential history in his willingness to summon the demons of bigotry and intolerance in service to himself. He began his political career on a lie about President Barack Obama's citizenship and has failed to firmly condemn the words and deeds of white supremacists, neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan leaders, and other bigots who rallied behind him. Your thoughts this morning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to go all the way back to the time when the president was thinking of running for president, and he decided that what he was going to do was talk about President Obama's birth certificate and the fact that he wasn't he was born in Hawaii, and insinuate that he was in fact born in Kenya. That was the foundation of a racist lie that really spoke to something that a lot of Republicans had for a long time wanted to shove into a corner. Donald Trump at that time spoke directly to it. This is a very analogous situation. I think that politicians have always known that these people are out there, the David Dukes, the white supremacists. They've been out there for a long time. I think Republican politicians have shoved them in a corner, but Donald Trump is not doing that. That is not an accident. And it's also incredibly telling that, this is a presidency that has for context of other presidents. And the fact that white supremacists, the KKK, can march in Charlottesville with torches and then later kill someone, allegedly, with a vehicle in what appears to be an intentional attack. And the president doesn't speak at all to the long history of these groups terrorizing African Americans in this country, is a second part of this broader failure of this president to address the moment. Violence aside, the existence of KKK in the streets should draw condemnation. And that didn't happen. It's very telling. There's no acknowledgement that there's a history here, that it's not just today, that over a long period of time, these folks, these individuals and these groups were responsible for domestic terrorism for a large swath of this country. And, you know, the president still hasn't spoken out about that, despite all of the corrections and the revisions of his statement from his staff and from the vice president.
Well, look, and Abby, as you beautifully point out, the morality is fairly clear here. So is the logic. Remember, this president hammered the idea of calling terror and calling evil what it is. And then now with this, they argue, well, we didn't want to dignify the names of these groups. It's logically inconsistent, and it was morally vacant. And why that was, we don't know, but the White House should say more about it.
And I think that parallel is exactly right. By focusing on, we need to name the problem of radical Islamist terrorism, but silent on this. And Abby has eloquently pointed out that this is also the flip side of a defiantly ahistorical approach to the presidency. You cannot lead the nation if you don't want to deal with its history or perhaps don't understand it. And, you know, we've also played footsie for a long time with this idea that part of his base is ethno-nationalist. That's a very polite term for what is, in fact, white nationalist. And white nationalist is white supremacist.
All right, so in the next hour, we're going to talk to the mayor of Charlottesville and find out what's going on down there. As Kaylee Harding told us, the streets are back open, but what's the mood? And what should be the legacy of this situation? Then in the 8 o'clock hour, we're going to talk with a woman who was at the scene of that terrible car ramming, and she knew the victim, Heather Heyer. We'll get some perspective on what brought this young woman there and what she was about.
So important to remember her name and what she was fighting for that day. So is the growing criticism against President Trump's response to everything that unfolded in Charlottesville a sign that one of his closest advisors could soon be on the outs? The latest controversy, what it all means for Steve Bannon next.
Romans, it's Monday, August 14th. It is 5 a.m. exactly in the East. We'll be live from South Korea and Syria later in the hour. But first, President Trump under fire for failing to
clearly railed against President Obama for playing a lot of golf. But work can be done when you are on vacation. We know that. We saw President